In 1915, a black teenager in Charleston, South Carolina was accused of killing a white man. His name was Willie Johnson. He did not go to trial. He did not see a judge. His family knew what would happen next. A mob would come, a rope would be found, and Willie would be dead by morning. This was how justice worked in the South. Not through courts, not through law, through terror. Willie Johnson's family made a choice. They mortgaged their small home and scraped together every dollar they had. They sent Willie north in the night. He disappeared before the mob could find him. The killing was prevented. But the fear remained, and it changed everything for Willie's younger brother, a boy of 10 years old who watched his family lose their home to save his brother's life. A boy who would grow up to become one of the most feared men in Harlem. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The world would come to know him as Bumpy. What happened to Willie Johnson? And how did that night shape the man who had become known as the godfather of Harlem? Charleston, South Carolina, in the early 1900s was a place where black families lived under constant threat. The Civil War had ended slavery 50 years earlier. The Constitution promised citizenship and equal rights. But those promises meant nothing in the streets of Charleston. Lynching was not an aberration. It was a system. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,000 black Americans were lynched in the southern United States. South Carolina alone recorded over 180 lynchings during this period. These were not secret crimes. They were public spectacles. Crowds gathered, photographs were taken, postcards were sold. The message was clear. Black people were not citizens. They were subjects. Any perceived violation of the racial order would be met with death. The threat against Willie Johnson came after he was accused of a crime that in any other community would have resulted in arrest and trial. But in Charleston, an accusation from a white person was enough. There was no need for evidence, no need for witnesses. The colour of Willie's skin made him guilty. His family understood this immediately. They knew the police would not protect him. They knew the courts would not save him. Lynching was the law in practice, even if not in writing. The Johnson family faced an impossible choice. They could wait and hope the mob would not come. Or they could act. They chose to act. Willie Johnson's parents, Margaret and William, owned a small home in Charleston. It was modest, but it was theirs. It represented years of work and sacrifice. They took out a mortgage on that home to raise money. Every penny was used to send Willie north. He left Charleston in secret and went to live with relatives in a northern city, where he might have a chance at survival. The plan worked. Willie escaped. He was not lynched. But the cost was enormous. The family lost their home. They lost their stability. And young Ellsworth, just 10 years old, learned a lesson he would never forget. The law did not protect black people. The police did not serve black families. Justice was not blind. It was white. And if you wanted to survive, you had to be willing to fight. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905 in Charleston. He was given the nickname Bumpy because of a large bump on the back of his head. It was visible and unusual, and the name stuck. As a boy, Bumpy was known for his temper. He did not back down from confrontation. He did not accept disrespect. This was dangerous for a black child in the South. White people expected deference. They expected submission. Bumpy refused to give either. His parents saw the danger. They had already lost their home to save one son. They could not afford to lose another. In 1919, when Bumpy was 14 years old, they made the same choice. They sent him north to Harlem to live with his older sister Mabel. Harlem in 1919 was a place of transformation. The Great Migration had begun. Hundreds of thousands of black Americans were fleeing the South, escaping the violence and terror of Jim Crow. They came to cities like New York, Chicago and Detroit looking for work, safety and dignity. Harlem became the center of black cultural and intellectual life in America. It was home to jazz clubs, churches, newspapers and political movements. But it was also a place where the promises of the North proved fragile. Black families in Harlem faced police brutality, discrimination in housing and employment, and poverty. The law was more subtle than in the South, but it was no less oppressive. Bumpy arrived in Harlem as a teenager with a thick Southern accent and a small frame. He was an easy target for bullies, but his temper protected him. He fought back. He learned to use a knife. He learned to use a gun. And he learned that respect in Harlem was not given. It was taken. Bumpy dropped out of school and began working odd jobs. He hung around street corners and pool halls. He watched how the underworld operated. He saw that the people with power in Harlem were not the politicians or the police. They were the numbers runners, the loan sharks, and the enforcers. These were people who operated outside the law because the law did not serve them. Bumpy decided he wanted that power. His first break came when he caught the attention of a gangster named William Hewitt. Hewitt ran illegal gambling operations and needed enforcers to protect his business. Bumpy was young, fearless, and willing to do whatever was necessary. Hewitt hired him. Bumpy became a bodyguard for high-rolling gamblers. He carried a knife and a gun. He was quick to violence and slow to forgive. His reputation grew. People knew not to cross him. People knew that Bumpy Johnson was someone to fear. But the person who truly shaped Bumpy's future was a woman named Stephanie St. Clair. She was known throughout Harlem as Queenie, or Madame St. Clair. She was a black woman from the French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, who had arrived in New York in 1912. She spoke multiple languages, she dressed in elegant clothes, and she ran one of the most successful illegal gambling operations in Harlem. Her game was called the Numbers Racket. It was a lottery system designed for working-class black people who could not access mainstream banks or investment opportunities. Players would bet small amounts of money on 3-digit numbers. If their number came up, they won. St. Clair operated dozens of numbers banks across Harlem. She employed runners, accountants, and enforcers. She made over $20,000 a year in the 1920s, which would be worth nearly $300,000 today. St. Clair was also an activist. She placed advertisements in Harlem newspapers educating black residents about their legal rights. She spoke out against police brutality and corruption. She was outspoken, fearless, and unapologetic. She was everything Bumpy admired. In the early 1930s, St. Clair hired Bumpy Johnson as her chief enforcer. He became her bodyguard and her most trusted soldier. Together, they controlled a significant portion of Harlem's gambling economy. But their dominance would not last. In 1933, the end of Prohibition destroyed the profits of white mobsters who had grown rich selling illegal alcohol. They looked for new sources of income, and they turned their eyes to Harlem. The man who led the charge was a Jewish gangster named Dutch Schultz. Schultz was based in the Bronx and controlled illegal gambling operations in other parts of New York. He decided he wanted Harlem. He sent his men into the neighborhood to demand protection money from numbers operators. Those who refused were beaten, some were killed. The violence was systematic and brutal. It was designed to break resistance and force submission. St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson refused to pay. They fought back. What followed was a war that lasted for years. More than 40 people were killed in gang-related violence. Bumpy Johnson personally carried out murders and kidnappings. He targeted Schultz's men in broad daylight. He was fearless and relentless. But the war was unwinnable. Schultz had something St. Clair and Bumpy did not have. He had the police. Corrupt officers worked for Schultz. They raided St. Clair's operations. They arrested her employees. They looked the other way when Schultz's men committed violence. St. Clair tried to fight back legally. She took out advertisements in Harlem newspapers accusing senior police officers of corruption. She testified before the Seabury Commission, a state investigation into police misconduct. Her testimony led to the dismissal of more than a dozen officers, but it was not enough. Schultz had political connections, he had money, and he had the law on his side. By 1935, St. Clair realized she could not win. She decided to step back. She handed control of her operations to Bumpy Johnson. He was 30 years old, and now the most powerful black gangster in Harlem, but he faced the same problem St. Clair had faced. Schultz was too strong. Bumpy needed an alliance. He needed someone who could stand up to Schultz. That person was Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was an Italian-American mob boss who controlled much of organized crime in New York. He was the head of what would later be known as the Genovese crime family. Luciano and Bumpy were enemies. They had fought on opposite sides of the Harlem War. But Luciano was pragmatic. He saw that the war was bad for business. He also saw that Schultz had become reckless and unpredictable. Schultz had angered other mob bosses with his refusal to follow orders. In October 1935, Luciano ordered Schultz's assassination. Schultz was shot in a restaurant in New Jersey. He died the next day. With Schultz dead, Luciano made Bumpy Johnson an offer. Bumpy could control all of Harlem's gambling operations as an independent operator. He would not have to answer to the Italian mob, but he would have to pay a percentage of his profits to Luciano's organization. In return, the mob would not interfere in Harlem. They would not try to take over his territory. Bumpy agreed. The deal was unprecedented. For the first time, a black gangster had negotiated with the white mob on equal terms. Bumpy had not bowed down. He had not surrendered. He had stood his ground and earned respect. The people of Harlem noticed. Bumpy Johnson became a hero to many in the community. He was seen as someone who had stood up to white power and survived. Bumpy ruled Harlem for the next 3 decades. He controlled the numbers rackets, extortion operations, and protection schemes. He made millions of dollars, but he also gave back to the community. He handed out cash to poor families. He bought food for children. He paid for funerals when families could not afford them. He was feared and loved in equal measure. But the lesson he had learned as a boy in Charleston never left him. The lesson of Willie Johnson and the lynch mob. The lesson that the law would not protect you. That the police were not on your side. That if you wanted justice, you had to take it yourself. This shaped how Bumpy dealt with threats. He did not go to the police. He did not rely on the courts. When someone crossed him, he responded with overwhelming force. When Schultz's men came to Harlem, Bumpy did not negotiate. He killed them. When corrupt police officers tried to shake him down, he did not pay. He exposed them. When rival gangsters tried to take his territory, he went to war. This approach shocked both criminals and law enforcement. Most black gangsters in that era tried to stay under the radar. They paid bribes. They avoided confrontation. They knew that standing up to white authority was dangerous. But Bumpy was different. He had grown up watching his family sacrifice everything to save his brother from a lynch mob. He had seen firsthand that submission did not guarantee safety, that playing by the rules did not protect you. He decided early in his life that he would rather die fighting than live in fear. The police were alarmed by Bumpy's approach. They were used to being able to control black criminals through intimidation and violence, but Bumpy did not intimidate easily. He carried weapons at all times. He had loyal enforcers who would die for him, and he was willing to kill police officers if necessary. There are stories, some confirmed and some legend, of Bumpy confronting corrupt officers. One story claims he once walked into a police station alone to settle a dispute. Another says he sent a message to a crooked detective by leaving a dead rat on his doorstep. Whether these stories are entirely true is unclear, but they were believed, and belief was what mattered. The police knew that Bumpy Johnson was not afraid of them, and that changed the dynamic of power in Harlem. Criminal groups also had to adjust. Other gangsters in Harlem saw Bumpy's success and realized that submission was not the only option. Young criminals looked up to him. They wanted to work for him. They wanted to learn from him. Bumpy became a mentor to a generation of black gangsters, including Frank Lucas, who would later take over Harlem's heroin trade. Lucas learned from Bumpy that respect was earned through action, not words. That power came from being willing to do what others were not. That survival in a racist system required refusing to accept the rules of that system. The long-term impact of Bumpy Johnson's career cannot be overstated. He proved that black criminals could negotiate with the Italian mob. He proved that black communities could resist white control, and he proved that a man from the South who had fled a lynch mob as a boy could become one of the most powerful men in New York. But he also represented the tragedy of his time. Bumpy Johnson was intelligent, charismatic, and capable. In a different world, he might have been a politician, a businessman, or a community leader. But he was born into a system that gave him no legitimate path to power. The law did not protect him. The economy did not include him. The police did not serve him. So he turned to crime, and he excelled at it. Bumpy Johnson spent much of his later life in prison. He was convicted of drug conspiracy in 1952 and sentenced to 15 years. He served most of that time in Alcatraz, the infamous federal prison in San Francisco Bay. He was released in 1963. 5 years later, on July the 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant. He was 62 years old. He had been eating a meal when he collapsed. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Thousands of people attended his funeral. They came to pay their respects to a man who had lived by his own rules, a man who had refused to be afraid, a man who had stood up to a system designed to destroy him. The story of Bumpy Johnson begins with a lynch mob in Charleston, South Carolina in 1915. It begins with a family that mortgaged their home to save a son. It begins with a 10-year-old boy who learned that the law was not on his side. That lesson shaped everything that came after. It shaped how Bumpy saw the world. It shaped how he responded to threats. It shaped how he built his empire in Harlem. And it shaped how he is remembered today. This was not the moment Bumpy Johnson became powerful. It was the moment he learned how power worked. He learned that power was not given, it was taken. He learned that respect was not earned through submission, it was earned through strength. He learned that in a world designed to kill him, survival meant refusing to be afraid, and Harlem would never forget it.